Richard Black. Thank you very much to the panel for the... Thanks, folks. Thank you very much for the presentations. They're really good. I don't know if this mic's sufficiently close to my mouth. Yeah. There we go.
Not very good.
I don't know. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Now it's on. So thank you very much, Richard Black. My question is not about should we partner, should we not partner, but it's more concerned with the larger context within which this happens. And I've used this example in the past, and it's specifically with respect to tenure at universities and young researchers, young academicians. And I asked, this is at University of Missouri, I asked, what is more important, a number of grants that you might get from food industry collaborations or participation on a WHO panel for tenure? And the answer was clear, participation on the WHO panel. But they really encourage young researchers to partner with industry. And I said, did you know that if you partner with industry, you absolutely cannot participate on a WHO panel? And they said, I didn't know that. So yes, you can encourage partnership with industry all you like. But if the standard is, hey, get appointments, and we heard that was so important, you're asking them to choose between that and possibly a WHO panel. How do you address that core problem when you've got conflicts in terms of incentive within the academic structure?
Bobby's going to comment.
I do want to comment on what you've said about the WHO panels. I don't know all of the WHO process, but I do know the group that I'm a member of. And before each meeting, we have to submit a declaration of interest. So we have to declare the kinds of activities, the external activities. It doesn't disqualify us from serving on the panel. It gives the agency an opportunity to evaluate whether or not that declaration of interest generates a conflict of interest. So on the panel that I've been on, and then that's published in the recommendation, they will say this is what we reviewed, whether or not they found that there was any conflict, and so someone could be recused from one part of the deliberation if indeed a conflict was there.
Branca. Is it Branca? Francesco Branca?
Branca,
yeah,
yes.
He was the guy that told me this.
Yeah. You know, I'm just telling you my experience. So I don't think it's quite that black and white that indeed there could be a situation where the nature of your partnership means you can't be involved with decision making on a particular issue, but that doesn't mean every interaction has that same. But I'd rather have somebody from WHO speak to it. I'm just telling you my experience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the talks. I'll be honest, I was a little nervous when I saw that the title of this was Rigor and then Funding. I was afraid that it was going to be a little bit more charged, but I was glad to see that a lot of the focus was really on the rigor instead of just chasing the conflicts. But one of the things that came out from a number of the talks is that the conflict statements are not necessarily particularly useful, and they're very time-consuming. No matter how much we would, some of us anyway, would like them to go away, they're here to stay. And one of the things that we kind of need to move forward is to figure out how to make that system a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more universal. One thing that a number of people have recommended is having a single location for conflict of interest disclosure, because I don't really know. A couple of the speakers even said, oh, well, here are my conflicts, but they don't, you know, they're not really conflicts. And well, that's what we all feel. I write a paper and I don't know which things are going to be the things that I'm going to be attacked for my affiliations. I was curious if any of you were familiar with any ways that people are trying to streamline this process to make it so if I didn't think something was a conflict and, you know, a certain blogger does, that I'm not then unduly attacked despite trying to do the best I can.
Do I know of anybody who's trying to streamline this? No.
I can offer a brief response, and obviously Andrew and I, we've talked about this before, but so I strongly agree that we need a central way of reporting conflict. So rather than each of us reports what we think is often relevant, which is a particularly key question and it's highly subjective, and having to report in a 1-year time frame for this organization and a 3-year for that organization, and this one wants only commercial, and that one wants everything, and so on and so forth. I think I'd rather we just each had our own investigator ID, and on some public government website, we could just upload all of our financial interests that we have, and they could be up there forever, and your entire conflict of interest statement, I'd say my investigator ID is X, and then you can just go look it up and you can see everything and you can decide what you think is or is not relevant, and then all you have to do is just give that number every single time at every conference, at every paper, and so on and so forth. I think would save a lot of headaches. And Dr. Lynch, I think you should get the NIH to implement this. Thank you.
What I want to comment to your question, I think disclosure is what is important, and I think what Dick has just said sort of emphasizes that. We've created a situation where we're implying the mere fact that you disclose you have a conflict of interest, and that if you disclose that there's something wrong, my feeling is, no, the problem is the people who don't disclose. That's what we want to get away from. We want to make sure that disclosure is there, you can evaluate whether or not what I disclose to you biased my comments. I shouldn't be the one to evaluate that. My responsibility should be to disclose any potential conflicts. Just because you do something doesn't mean it's in and of itself a conflict of interest, but it may be an indication of what kind of bias you have in approaching a particular topic. So anything we can do to get disclosure, I think, is what's more important, and take away the stigma from disclosure.
Okay, good response.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Sharma, you separated out kind of selling an idea as a bias, which I totally agree with you. In nutrition, don't we have a terrible problem of separating out the food industry from the health industry? It seems like they're inherently there's a disparate intent here between these two industries. Now, how do we handle that? How do we assure the public that we're right down the middle?
Well, I think the overlap happens when the food industry tries to make health claims.
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly when it happens, right? I mean, if you're claiming that your food tastes the best, you know, can't argue with that. If you want to argue that your food is going to improve my health, you're actually making a health claim, and I think ultimately the same rigor has to go to those health claims as the health claims, as the rigor you would apply to a pharmaceutical company making a claim saying, you know, my drug is going to cure your cancer. Well, show me the data. We're not doing that in the food industry for reasons that, you know, maybe historical, maybe not practical, maybe not feasible, I don't know. But I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. I'm very comfortable with a lot of the data that comes out of the pharmaceutical industry because I know how those, you know, the effort and the restrictions and the way that, the work gets done, because I've been involved in that work. I'm not so sure about all of the other claims.
Thank you. Roxana Valdez from Mexico. I'm very happy about the session. I think it was very interesting. But I also think we should be discussing the peer review process and the bias from the peer reviewers. A lot of us are peer reviewers, and we also have our own biases. And, you know, FDA and all the agencies here and everywhere need the rigorous and reproducible science. And we need the positive and the negative results. And still, even though journals have told us that they're willing to publish negative results, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen when it goes through peer review. So it's not only the funding and it's not only the conflict of interests in the funding, but it's also the conflict of interests in the peer review process of publishing. And I think we should have a whole other session in this topic. Scary.
I'd like to respond to that a little, if I may. So I think that there are a number of aspects embedded in that. One is sort of the common idea that the peer review process is broken. It's not rigorous enough. It doesn't pick up enough. And whether it's broken or not, I don't know. I'm not sure it ever was designed and could be designed in anything like its present form to truly be the gatekeeper. I don't think it's fair to expect that much from the peer reviewers. I think they're meant to give you some advice. They can't possibly check everything in your paper. With respect to the idea of bias against null findings, this is a common thing we hear, that people say, well, I can't publish my null findings. I'm not sure if it was ever true. If it was true once, it is certainly not true today. It has been studied by people like Kay Dickerson at Johns Hopkins, who has shown that the publication bias is primarily at the level of authors who choose not to submit their null findings and not at the level of them getting bounced. There are now the new open access publishers that have completely eliminated this problem. And so one may not get one's paper published in Science if it has null findings, I grant you, but not all papers perhaps merit being published in Science. You can upload your paper this afternoon to F1000 as just one example. It does not even need to undergo peer review, and it will be posted within a week, and there it is for everybody to see, and then it will undergo peer review. And if it never passes, you can still leave it up there for anybody to read. And if it passes peer review, that's fine. And things like Frontiers and PLOS One and F1000 are all there to publish these papers. And they explicitly say, we will not reject a paper because of null findings or of it's not interesting or it's a replication. They will only reject papers if they are believed to be technically unsound.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paul Zimmer. I'm with Ingredion, so I'm with industry. And I am feeling that there's a bit of a disconnect between what can be achieved through industry intent and what is coming down from, say, an FDA review of a qualified health claim or something. In that if the intent we have, for example, right now, we're implementing a process that our investigator contracts for clinical trials are going to include recommendations to follow consort guidelines when reporting all results to improve the chance that it can reach the level of the JADAD criteria or whatever for a review in the future. That being said, if our intent is good and we produce a number of high quality studies, the requirement to include every study that might possibly be relevant, including the ones from journals that don't follow any kind of level of standards here, means we're kind of filling up a garbage can with a lot of studies that make muddying our ability to do good science and present them. So I guess that would be my point and question is, how does good intentions improve in this particular situation?
Right, and that, your comment, I think, comes to the point that we need to have the criteria in place. So if indeed there are older studies that don't come up to the mark, that those can be the kind of studies that either get set aside because you can't draw a conclusion relative to the health claim from those studies, or in the quality evaluation process, they're counted as lower quality studies, and so making it difficult to use that to substantiate. And you have to understand that one of the reasons that qualified health claims exist is because of the legal challenges which FDA lost. So qualified health claims exist because of a First Amendment issue in terms of compelling or suppressing speech. And FDA has done what it can in that framework to say under this rubric of qualified health claims we can put some mark of the quality of evidence that supports the claim. And FDA has indicated that it is willing to reevaluate claims. It, you know, in the giant workload of the world, it can be hard to do that, but it has indicated a willingness to reevaluate claims as well.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm Maya Jack with the American Beverage Association, and I'd like to take this just one step further. So we've heard about conflicts, we've heard about review. My question actually relates to standards. And building on what Dr. Allison said and what we're hearing from the questions and even what Dr. Sharma said, and this is actually to the whole panel, but more specifically to Dr. Schneeman, in terms of your opinion on the purpose of some of the different research that's in the literature. So what it's being used for. So in the case of health claims, you have the strong scientific agreement standard that needs to be applied. Relative to trying to establish relationships between dietary components and disease, which then is leveraged to make policy, what kind of standard should be applied to determining whether or not there is that actual relationship? Should the strong scientific agreement standard that is applied to health claims be also at the same time be applied to establishing these kinds of relationships between dietary components and disease?
Let me make it clear, I'm no longer at FDA, and so I'm not speaking for them or speaking for any government agency for that matter. I do believe that having a high quality of scientific standard is important, and to make it clear what the strength of the evidence is important. When you think about making it's one thing to make recommendations, and that can be a part of the scientific debate. It's another decision to move that recommendation into regulation. And the significant scientific agreement standard was created because we don't want to sort of change our conclusion because of future research. That if we're moving recommendations into regulation, it's much harder to change a regulation than it is to change a recommendation based on new science. So to me, that's where it's so important that as we move into a regulatory environment, we're asking that question: what's the likelihood that this could be reversed or something different concluded if there's new scientific evidence? Is there enough evidence to know we're on the right path at this point? So.
Hi, I'm Catherine McMurray with the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. This has been an amazing session, and I really want to, my question is, how can we promote the greater culture of truthfulness and integrity? Having worked the first half of my career in the food industry, second half of my career still in the government, I know that, and I've seen that bias exists everywhere. And the biggest issue I have seen is that people don't acknowledge their own biases because they're right. They believe they're right. They find evidence to justify that they're right. And to me, the most problematic bias that's just infiltrates, who we are. We're all people. We all live in this world. We all, deal with these issues. But it's the public health agenda that is very prevalent in the government, especially right now. That, the prospect that we have these major urgent public health issues, we've got to do something, we've got to help people, we've got to rally the evidence to support our cause. And so I'm just, and some of us, I want to say, many of us really hoped that instituting the systematic evidence review process would just do away with all the biases, and it would be like putting in the input into a computer and it'd spit out the results and you wouldn't even need a committee. But what I've seen happen is that there are actually even more routes for bias to creep into the process. And so I don't expect a simple answer. This is a very complex question, but I'd really like to see some effort to, how can we institute a broad-based acknowledgement, disclosure of where the biases are and why we are making the recommendations we're making for public health recommendations.
So sometimes I think the nutrition research community may be its own worst enemy. Some of the strongest criticisms of nutrition research come from within the field. So it's hard to find that right balance where you're trying to make sure to hold everyone to the right standard, but yet you're not trying to make sensational headlines. And I think that sometimes we are our own worst enemies when we question integrity in a way that's not useful. It's not really talking about whether the research is sound research. It's just kind of innuendo. Therefore, if it was funded by industry and it's positive, it must be false. And the public hears that and they don't they aren't taking time to think about the fact of whether the research can be believed. They just see the sensational headlines. So sometimes I think we're our own worst enemies.
And actually, I'd like to build on that a little bit as well, because I think we are our worst enemies if we sort of think about, well, we're here in the nutrition community or the health community, and they're there in the public health community. I think what we need to figure out is how can we frame nutrition and the science and the integrity of the nutrition as a genuine public health issue, and begin to bring in broader people as part of the dialogue, because I don't think we're ever going to get anywhere if we continue in our scientific silos, if you will. I think we're going to have to figure out how to engage, because the future of public health is absolutely dependent on the integrity of the research that we're pursuing. And I think that's a really key point that we often miss when we frame it in terms of a we or a they.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you. Michael McBurney, DSM Nutritional Products. This has been really interesting. Most of us and all of us in this room are here because I think we have an agenda, a bias. That diet and nutrition is, food is our medicine and it's going to be our health. We've also accepted a paradigm that is really a toxicology model based on a dose and a response, and frequently, it seems, with health claims, it's on the dose that you need to prevent a disease. Isn't it time to change the conversation and to actually be moving, as was done with vitamin D, to look at criterion of adequacy and ways and tools to measure status and whether people are in that healthy range, which I think Europe and EFSA are doing, with structure function claims rather than focusing on what's the dose in a serving or that needs to be taken to prevent a disease, but to look at that healthy status. Is my vitamin D status appropriate or not? If not, then what are the means to increase that status, and we can avoid the food wars that we seem to be dissolving into.
Thank you for the comment. I alluded in my comments to the fact that the kind of claims that are done under the truthful and not misleading provision, which generally are referred to as structure function claims, those are not reviewed by FDA. It's the manufacturer's responsibility to substantiate. And if FDA believes it's not truthful, it can go out and challenge. It's harder actually to go out and challenge if it's just misleading, because we would have to have empirical evidence to prove that it's misleading. And there are many who've argued that FDA should be, like EFSA, reviewing structure function claims. And my feeling is there's just simply not the resources to do it. I mean, we can barely, the agency, I should say, not we, but they can barely keep up with structure function under the DSHEA, the dietary supplement framework. It does raise the question, though, is this something where our professional societies could play a role? What would it mean for putting in place a system where some external third party is willing to say, we'll review your evidence for your structure function claim, because we're trying to get more information out about how do you maintain your health. It would not be an easy task to undertake, but it's probably one worth talking about.
Michael, the Food Nutrition Board will be looking at the framework that we use as one of the principal sources of authoritative claims. And indeed, I think we are going to be taking, I hope, once the committee is set up, a much broader look, moving away from the toxicological model or the disease deficiency, or nutrient deficiency model. Not because neither have been effective. I think that the entire nutrition community can take credit for the incredible reduction in deficiency diseases now, not only domestically, but internationally. The next goal is going to be, well, how do we enhance, build on that track record, and indeed, perhaps it is a bias, but hopefully an informed one, that nutrition does play a role in health. And in playing that role, how do we do the same to chronic disease related to diet as we have done to deficiency diseases? And it may very well encompass a much broader framework than the one we've used traditionally.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for staying 30 minutes over time, and thank you to the excellent speakers we had today.